beef. Oh, I did so many squats. I can't even get in the chair in an energetic way. Over the years that I have been creating content, a shift that has long been happening within the science fiction fantasy space seems to have reached its zenith. The genres we knew so well of fantasy and sci-fi continued to bleed and bleed into each other until the Venn diagram has become remarkably overlapped. Not entirely, of course, but just more so than ever. Combine that with the continued evolution of other genres slowly incorporating more fantastical elements over the years, and what are we really left with? Where are the bounds of where this channel can go? Is historical fiction off the table? I would say nay, sir. I would like to read and review some historical fiction for you one day. And so for henceforth now on, I'm planning on labeling this channel a speculative fiction space. We are no longer constrained by the terms science fiction or fantasy, and instead we are open, encompassing, progressive. Basically, I just want an excuse to broaden my horizons, and to celebrate that, today we're going to be making a list of my personal top 10 speculative fiction reads. Basically, they're all still science fiction and fantasy to some degree, but I no longer feel the need to limbo and justify talking about certain books, and instead, we can all just have a wonderful time chatting about literature we love. So without any further ado, here are my top 10 speculative fiction reads of all time. Ask me tomorrow, it might change a little bit, the order, and a couple new ones might come in, but in general, these are 10 that I think are magnificent and you should read. And making this even a little bit harder for myself, there's no restrictions on the table. It could be a book 10 in a massive epic or a standalone. These are just, with broad strokes, the 10 best entries I view fall into this wide umbrella. With that being said, I'd actually like to talk about an honorable mention before we hit number 10. Over the years, I feel I have been a little too hard on George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones legacy, specifically like A Song of Ice and Fire as a whole. Obviously, there have been missteps in this franchise and record-breaking success, but when it comes to the actual books, the foundation for what A Song of Ice and Fire is built on, a few of them are genuinely masterpieces. And I mean it when I say a few, but one in particular I would like to give a ton of credit for, and that would be Storm of Swords. It's rare to find what I would call a perfectly balanced book. A book that does not have pacing issues. All of its action is clear, concise, and hits. The characters are immediately bombastic on the page, yet are able to evolve in realistic yet dramatic ways. And Storm of Swords, being later on in the A Song of Ice and Fire series, benefits from obviously a ton of the groundwork that's laid. I was just looking at it and I noticed it's in the wrong spot here. Oh wait, these are all out of order. Christ. How did none of you catch that? Bad goblins. I should have gotten comments about that. Somehow your responsibility. And while none of the A Song of Ice and Fire books are going to crack my personal top 10, I would feel like I'm doing a bad job to not at least, one, put aside the whole seasons of drama and all this crap, looking at just the quality of the source material itself, not at least giving an honorable mention to what I feel is the best A Song of Ice and Fire book and is a benchmark for many different authors in the genre today to test their best work against. George R.R. Martin has the potential to go down as one of the top 5 most influential authors of all time for the fantasy space. I will argue that any day, especially if we're looking at like wider entertainment as a whole. And for that reason, and so many more, A Storm of Swords is my honorable mention of the top 10 list. Before we get into my top 10 speculative fiction books though, real quick, happy to announce our next merch drop is live and it's for Pride Month. Fantasy, it'd be a bit gay, and we're here to celebrate that. So if you want to go ahead and get any of these amazing designs you're seeing on screen, head on over to danielbgreene.com, and a couple of them we can't show here. They're a bit not safe for work. We decided to pride it up. We're priding. And so if you'd like to see those, click the link if you dare. I don't know what that was. Anyway, on to the video. But from a middle of a series entry for number 10, we are actually going to be switching gears into a standalone. This standalone comes from an author whose weight has so much significance currently in just speculative fiction as a whole, but also I would also argue just even breaking outside of that wide bound, just literature. And it comes from Cormac McCarthy with what I still think is his best book, The Road. I've said a few times here on the channel that one of the great appeals of speculative fiction, fantasy or science fiction, is it is able to use what if to access greater emotions, or possibly emotions we can't even entirely put words to. There is, in my opinion, nothing lost aside from maybe a bit of realism by incorporating speculative fiction elements, what if, into your story. And The Road is an apocalyptic science fiction book about, well, we don't entirely know, ended our society, and now we follow a father and son as they do their best to make it to a possible place of maybe some reprieve in this horrible world. And when it comes to that emotional range that speculative fiction opens the door to, the higher stakes that come through, you know, having your characters exist in an apocalypse, The Road is kind of the best to ever do it in terms of putting a sinking feeling in your gut and just holding it there. This is a true story. The copy of The Road that I read in high school and lent out to a bunch of friends, I had gotten from my school's library. I don't think I ever returned it, sorry. And near one of the back pages was like this black eroded substance. I don't know who put what I think was at the end of the day just like a really old piece of gum that had dried out in those pages. But as I got through the book, somehow in my mind, that like smudge of black grossness that kept flecking off became representative of that feeling this book successfully sunk into me. And it does not leave. Not only while reading the book page to page, like somehow Cormac McCarthy from beginning to final word is painting a terrifying canvas. I would argue The Road in many ways is horror, but after completing this book, I guarantee you it will stick with you like someone spread Gorilla Glue all along your back and slapped the cover on you. Don't get me wrong, is a tragedy, a misery, a slog in the best way possible, in one where you are going to be compelled to come back, turn page after page, not enjoying a second of it. And I would specifically say if you were someone who enjoyed Children of Men, which is like a 10 out of 10 movie in my opinion, absolutely check out The Road. I'm gonna try and give you recommendation, like comparisons for each of these. Next up, I would feel this list is just incomplete, not a good speculative fiction top 10, if I did not have one Octavia Butler book in it. This is an author who just in the background in my reading career has dropped consistently 9s and 10s. I don't think I've given Octavia Butler a below a 9. And I was this close to giving this to Kindred, but instead I have to turn and admit that Parable of the Sower is still probably my favorite Octavia Butler book. Ignoring all of the weird parallels that we talked about in the review for Parable of the Sower, where it seems Octavia Butler could have been a bit of a prophet. In reality, she was just like, you know, the South Park Simpsons effect, where if you predict obvious logical things, that this will be the end result of some degradation within our society, you will be right. And she happened to be right about a lot of the predictions Octavia Butler made because she's very smart and a great writer. But in this speculative fiction book, we follow Lauren, who has an ability that makes her very important within a split United States. And we follow this girl as she tries to survive moving from one location to another. I'm trying to keep it spoiler free here. The wealthy are more divided from the poor than ever. Climate change has wreaked havoc, and social inequality has not been solved, but instead exacerbated by politicians for political gain. Oh, ringing true a little bit here. And what follows is one of the most beautifully written, thought-provoking examples of what speculative fiction can do when it's commentating on us. We actually just had another recent example here on the channel of another book that was trying to do this form of social commentary in The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin, which by all rights is like on a similar level of near perfection for what it's trying to accomplish that Octavia Butler achieved here with Parable of the Sower. But there's this extra spice.
The Spice Melange.
From Octavia Butler as a writer that manages to elevate nearly everything she does as being distinctly her own, which kind of just edges her out above so many other writers in my opinion. There is a flavor in execution of nearly all elements to her storytelling that is distinctly Octavia Butler. Her prose are unique, not overcomplicated, a bit dry, yet with strokes of passion and insight that kind of like lull you into being one of these books that you'll find yourself always reading more of Octavia Butler than you sat down to plan to read, in my opinion. And she was releasing these books when prose for these genres were not as refined as we've seen them come at times. And my recommendation here might feel a bit unorthodox, outside the ballpark. I don't know if that's the right expression. I think I combined outside the box and knocking it out of the park. Both apply, but follow me here. If you like The Last of Us, please read Parable of the Sower. I think, one, there's direct influence. I'd be really surprised if the creative team behind The Last of Us has not cited Parable of the Sower in some way. Not that they're zombies, but approach. It's kind of also in that Children of Men category of just outstanding visions of the future that feel disturbingly possible. One of the thickest Discworld books, Going Postal is a standalone you can actually use as an entry point to the over 30 book long series. There's several standalones within it. I actually think Good Omens is probably tied with Neil Gaiman, and this is just me having a sneaky way of putting another recommendation in here for you while acting like I'm just going on a tangent, whatever. Anyway, Going Postal though I like a bit more, and for me, it has the entire appeal of Discworld distilled down into one story, which is a feat. A lot of people talk about Discworld being a fantasy epic without really taking in the full scope of what Terry Pratchett accomplished into account. And I'm not trying to say that it has the breadth of Middle-earth. Yet, through following these different factions that you do through the various series within the Discworld series, the end result is a huge world that has more life to it than most other fantasy epics, and that's because of Terry Pratchett's devotion to putting a ton of character and soul into just the beating working class of his world. Whether it's Men-at-Arms, Going Postal, Making Money, or a plethora of other entries within Discworld, Terry Pratchett was really devoted to trying to tell the story of the little guy a lot of the times within his world. Yes, there's stories of kings, princes, death itself as well, but because of this effort, Discworld hits unlike anything else the fantasy genre has to offer, and I think that is perfectly represented here in Discworld. As most people preach about teachers getting a higher wage and, better treatment overall, which I completely agree with, I also feel about postal workers in modern society as well. It's something that I've been fixated on for a long time. I think postal workers are just gods among us. I'm not literally, you know what I mean? I really appreciate what they do. Shout out to our postal workers. And what you get here is the story of an unwilling entrant into the postal world with a history of being a bit of a swindler who then must act as a postmaster general. Get for the kingdom a mail service up and running, which sounds kind of interesting, but the level of humor and personal stakes Terry Pratchett is able to inject into Going Postal makes it stand out even among his Discworld catalog. I mean, yes, if you're a fan of just lighthearted, enjoyable things, check out Going Postal. But I'm also going to say specifically if you're a fan of Edgar Wright movies, I know, strange, also be sure to check out Discworld as a whole, but specifically Going Postal. There is something about the humor and the pacing too. Edgar Wright's editing, I find to match how Terry Pratchett can kind of fast forward and describe some things, yet you're still able to get this beautifully crisp image in your head. I just think there's some appeal overlap there. Tell me if I'm crazy, but Going Postal is going to be my solid number 8. And for my number 7, I'm thrilled to just have an excuse to talk about again, Jade Legacy, the third and final book in the Greenbone saga, a series that I have repeatedly put in my top 10 of all time. This single entry, this conclusion, was to me an immediate stamp of classic for the whole series. Not only did Greenbone Saga land on its best entry yet. Talk about sticking the landing. But in terms of being defining for like a type of genre for fantasy, I think Fonda Lee knocked it out of the park. Crime fantasy, especially urban crime fantasy, has been around for a while, but there is a big case to be made that the Greenbone saga will be the godfather compared to like the legacy of crime fantasy fiction going forward. The same level of just, this is the standard now, and everything touching on those genres will be compared to it. Being unabashedly fantasy with the jade element kind of powering the magic, not getting into spoilers, and how the crime family operates around that, the decay of our characters' morality as the crime world continues to erode on them. Greenbone Saga is absolute proof that we are fortunate enough right now to live among some of the authors, the best that speculative fiction has ever seen. Thought-provoking in its commentary on what is right and wrong for an individual versus society, progressive on its handling of not only these genres, but characterization, and unafraid, bold in knowing you will stay attached to characters who make bad decisions because the groundwork is there for you to completely understand wider conflicts and internal turmoil and the play between the two. And I'm going to maybe get crap for this recommendation. I don't care. Listen to me. I promise this makes sense. If you like Breaking Bad, I think you might like Greenbone Saga. There is obviously, like, I'm not just going for the easy, like, oh, rock, meth, rock. That's not, shut up. At their cores, both Breaking Bad and Greenbone Saga are, yes, set in these crime dramas, and the soul of their story is watching the effect of that on people who are trying to convince themselves they are better than. And for the cast of characters, that is true and false to a greater or lesser extent, and the conflict often derives from that contradiction. So if you like watching those type of scenes, the I am the one who knocks or Skylar, Walter and the knife type drama, this will also be scratching that itch for sure. But this takes me to my number 6, which is dark in a whole different way. Best Served Cold. I'm going to spend the least amount of time on this book because I have spent the most amount of time on this channel gushing about Joe Abercrombie as an author. And I've recommended Best Served Cold as a interesting place to test the waters for First Law for people because I do believe the first book in the full series is actually its weakest. And this is technically a standalone, but realistically, you should probably begin First Law with the First Law book, The Blade itself. But I kind of get eager to recommend Best Served Cold because I think it's one of the best fiction fantasy books I have ever come across. It, yes, as you've heard probably in its marketing, is very comparable to Kill Bill. Just that ultimate wish fulfillment revenge story that on surface level is already going to have a mass appeal to a lot of people, but executed arguably the best it's ever been done for speculative fiction. The book begins with Manza being stabbed in the back, losing quite a bit before rising from her metaphorical grave, and going on, in my opinion, the best journey we have ever seen within the First Law world. And excitingly, this story is going to become, in my opinion, very likely far more known in the coming years, far more appreciated because it has been announced that First Law is getting its first adaptation, and that will begin with Best Served Cold being adapted, which kind of backs up my argument that it's actually a perfectly great way to start the First Law series. And Rebecca Ferguson will be taking on Manza, which is just such perfect goddamn casting, with Tim Miller, yes, the one responsible for Deadpool, attached to direct. For inspiration for a lot of these standalones, Joe Abercrombie has talked about, even with me in an interview, how he tried to look at like different film genres, and this is that classic Western-ish revenge story. It's an 11 out of 10. From here on out, we're in the 11 out of 10 breaks my scale territory, and I think I've recommended this enough. I'll just say, if you like enjoying good things, read Best Served Cold, and f you if you haven't. That's my level of recommendation for it. If I could literally gamble, like stocks-wise, on a series just exploding in popularity, previously it would have been Cosmere whenever it got its first adaptation, but the fact that First Law has bumped ahead of it in line, it is now the one that I am like, yep, that's gonna be the next Game of Thrones. Except First Law is better than A Song of Ice and Fire. Fight me. That's how you get engagement and comments. Ah! But before we get in my number 5, a quick word from today's sponsor. But first I want to give a tremendous thank you to today's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one platform that's here to educate entrepreneurs to stand out online. Whether you're just starting out or managing an existing brand, Squarespace makes it easy to create a beautiful website, engage with your audience, all in one place, on your terms. Not only are you going to learn the tips and tricks of the trade, but it is jam-packed with features to help get your business off the ground and running. Their asset library allows you to upload, organize, and access all your content from one place, as well as manage all your files from one central hub and use them across the entire Squarespace platform. And for anyone who does not have a background like myself in coding, Squarespace's flexible website templates provide you with a list of professional designs for every category in use, which you can customize to fit your needs on every device. But my favorite part, as I've said before, you know what it's going to be, is the Fluid engine, making it so you can completely customize the website to the limitations of your imagination by just dragging and dropping the assets. So whether it's blogs, email campaigns, schedule management, or gated member areas, Squarespace has everything you're gonna need. So head on over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to make your first purchase, go to squarespace.com/Daniel Greene to save 10% on your first purchase of a domain or website to level up your business today. For my number 5 entry, I might make too grand of a statement here. I could come to regret being this definitive by tomorrow, but I still do want to say with my chest, my number 5 is the best self-published book ever released. It has since been picked up and given so many accolades, all of which I understand and endorse myself, and that would be by M.L. Wong, The Sword of Kaigen. The Sword of Kaigen has so much appeal for so many different kinds of fantasy fans. If you like Asian-inspired fantasy, if you like school, training, if you like commentary on duty, war, what it means to fight, believe in something, amazing character development and work. I will admit, its weakest part is its first third, but if you get through that, the excellence even like somewhat recontextualizes the slog of what you went through, and everything is elevated to prove self-publishing a book does not immediately mean something is not great. It purely means it flew under trad people's radar, which happens all the time. And I believe if I really look back and try and be reflective for a moment, this book, The Sword of Kaigen, M.L. Wong, is responsible for me having faith in self-published books and picking up so many others that I've come to love, like recently Dungeon Crawler Carl, which, you know, basically the same thing. Gun to my head, the biggest criticism I have for this book, and why the first third does have a bit of a struggle, is M.L. Wong is not the clearest communicator of information. I believe that is responsible for the first third kind of being the rougher experience that it is. But that makes this book also an example of just because you have a criticism for something does not mean you do not unabashedly love it. And it's okay, great to be critical of things you do love, so that when you try and maybe attempt your own artistic endeavor, you can pick it apart, see how you could possibly improve. I'm never going to write anything better than The Sword of Kaigen, but you get what I'm saying. This book, though, tells the story of the Matsuda family and their station on the Sword of Kaigen, which is a tip of a peninsula. They act as a vanguard, I think I'm using that word right, for an empire, and through the narrative we begin to learn things as our younger characters begin to train. We also get commentary from veterans on their experience in war and how it's changed them and their view of the world. I also kind of love this reveal that happens to the reader where the setting, you might think, oh, this doesn't make sense, it's very modern, and not, but then you realize how a culture is basically building a false setting over a modern society, and that from a world building perspective makes kind of Sword of Kaigen, at least in my experience of reading, aside from stories who like that is the main point of their narrative, fairly unique in the fantasy space. It's like if Middle-earth progressed into different ages, but they continued to have certain outposts and things that embraced the Middle-earth still style lifestyle. I don't know if I'm doing a good job explaining this. And as for a recommendation, I would say if you're someone who has not checked out indie publishing, an indie fantasy book, The Sword of Kaigen, I would say, is the best place to start. And it even has some of the trademark rougher edges, as I mentioned, of self-publishing, but it massively overcomes them. But this brings us to number 4. And for my 4th spot, I wanted to represent my love of horror. I am a huge fan of horror itself. I've gotten into quite a few horror books here on the channel, some of them disappointing. And some of my favorite just fantasy or science fiction books have these either just complete undertones of horror throughout them, or specifically sequences within them where horror is utilized to an incredible effect to either raise the stakes of the narrative or to emphasize the terror or awfulness of something that could happen because of the what if being posed in the speculative fiction narrative you're consuming. But for this specific spot, I wanted to look at something that is first and foremost a horror book that then is able to master horror in a way where it hits a nerve you didn't even know horror could go for. And for that specific reason, I'm picking a horror book that targets the feeling of grief. Stephen King is an author who's kind of known for not having bounds, limits to where he is willing to go. And there is no scarier book, especially as I've gotten older, that I have read from Stephen King than Pet Sematary. Man Carrying Thing has this beautiful skit. One of my favorite videos he's ever done. I was fortunate enough to be a part of it, where he just goes through Stephen King coming up with ideas and cycling through them. And for Pet Sematary, it does kind of just boil down to what if grief was scary? In this book, if you somehow do not know, our main character discovers a graveyard where if you bury your pet, it comes back to life, but it is different. This character then loses one of their children, and in the desperate, feverish groes of a world-shattering grief, brings their child's body to this graveyard. The end result of this and the emotional impact of seeing someone make such a tremendous mistake you know you would probably also make in their situation is so realistically approached from Stephen King in terms of everything that is felt from our main character. Do not watch the movie. Oh my God, it's not communicated there. Pet Sematary is a prime example of what can be achieved when you understand that feelings of terror, horror, are not as simple as a jump scare in your seat, but instead can almost be an artistic process in itself, planting seeds, installing ideas within the mind of the person consuming your story to then let them bloom later on and have these horrific realizations, consequences to actions, and all so importantly for the horror genre, keeping it believable. I've recommended, just as a friend, behind the scenes, quite a bit of Stephen King to Murphy Napier, fellow book reviewer here on the channel, and a dear, dear friend of mine. And she seems to have just not liked Stephen King, except for this one entry. Pet Sematary is a book that even Stephen King detractors, haters that I have given it to, will admit, oh my God, I get why Stephen King himself has said this is the book that he almost regrets releasing. Like it's too much on an emotional level, and it can borderline feel exploitative of the feeling of losing a child. Like it's such a far line to hit in a mainstream horror book like this, but it does it to like gymnast standing perfect success. Am I the only one who like pictures that? Whenever I like see something like it's like a perfect 10 for me, I always just picture that thing landing and doing one of those. And specifically, I would recommend this to people who, if you are a Stephen King detractor, you tried It, you tried The Shining, one of his books that's a little less clean than this one, still give it a go. It's nearly all of the appeal of Stephen King distilled down to its purest form, with none, in my opinion, of his frequent flaws, which I'm very willing to admit he has as an author. It's one of the few times he even just nailed a landing, an ending to a book from Stephen King that is, oh, chills. Y'all, I am so afraid to put this book this high in my top 10 of all speculative fiction placement. Like, I'm really terrified this is going to be something people point to as like, really? But with my chest, yes, Demon in White is my favorite Sun Eater book still, and is a primo example of you don't need to break the mold. You don't got to reinvent the wheel. Rely on the classics. Wear your influence on your sleeve. Just execute whatever it is you're trying to do really, goddamn well. And this chapter in the adventure of Hadrian Marlowe, the one character I can think of who successfully transitions from the beginning of series, coming across like Anakin Skywalker, to near the end of it, coming across like Commander Adama. I would say this is the book where he earns his moniker, the half-mortal, truly, beyond just like the actual example of it. This is where it like becomes more than a name. And while I've talked about so many of these books kind of being like deep or profound, managing incredible success on an emotional level, there's a lot of that, you know, certainly here in Demon in White. There's commentary on power, corruption, abandoning ideas you once believed in, seeing the snakes in court politics. And I actually think the court politic execution within Sun Eater is worth a video in itself. But the reason I want to put it this high, and the reason it has crawled past so many other books, is because this is badass. These don't really belong together for many reasons, but other things I rank incredibly high just because of their badass appeal include Evil Dead 2, Mad Max Fury Road, The Thing. Sun Eater as a whole is a series that is essentially a recounting of our future history speculatively, and this framing of maybe a bit of an unreliable narrator going through the greatest achievements in his life and how he became the Sun Eater has firmly placed itself as my favorite narrative framing for any science fiction or fantasy epic I have ever read. And I completely understand a lot of the detractors. If you don't like references to other fantasy works coming through the page a bit too overtly and a bit too often, this could annoy the hell out of you. And if you don't like following flawed characters who really need to learn some harsh lessons to be more likable, this could also be a massive turnoff for you. But if you are someone who's an investor, you really want to see someone go through the gambit of experience and come out the other side like it is an Odyssey, right? Pulling from those true classic tales. Nothing's doing it better than Sun Eater right now. And specifically for a recommendation, this should really make it clear how much I'm willing to put my soul into this. If you love the journey of Randall Thor, his growth and evolution, Hadrian Marlowe is one of the few fantasy characters I think actually rivals his level of change and experience and growth. And I'm not saying that because Hadrian Marlowe is also a redhead. That's not Hadrian Marlowe. He's actually raven hair. He's darker. This is Alexander. You read the books. And for number 2, I'm actually going to be talking about a book I bet a whole lot of you recently read due to its viral re-success. It was already a pretty successful release, and then everyone decided to give it a second go. And that would be a book that has stuck with me, again, like glue, since I consumed it, and that is going to be This Is How You Lose the Time War. A love story told through time. Entities that I still don't fully comprehend and understand interacting. As I've reevaluated the reading experience of This Is How You Lose the Time War, which by the way, was written by 2 authors passing back and forth the book, which is so cool alone. It might be the most impressive example of communication I've seen in a fiction book, because this is a book that is entirely communication. It's just about these people exchanging words and the relationship and world building conflict that develops from that. It is genius without flaw, I would even say. Like, yes, it might be one of the best romantic books I've ever consumed, but if you remove the romantic lens from it and start examining the technical execution of what was accomplished, This Is How You Lose the Time War should be dissected endlessly on how it was able to build stakes, poetically communicate really hard science fiction concepts to a reader, all while maintaining a pace and characters that remain ill-defined intentionally and like vacuum you through the narrative. I constantly am needing to read more next new things. This was a book that was so good, I did not care it put me behind. I ended up rereading it because I just needed to appreciate an artistic level what was accomplished. I think I've gotten between 10 to 15 people to read This Is How You Lose the Time War, and at nearly 100% success rate, all of them have put it in like their new top 10 books. You can get through it in a day, which is another impressive thing about this I Lose the Time War. Remarkably short for how much it gets through. This is also just another example of how we'll say more author collabs, please. If you are even a moderately successful author who happens to be watching this video, call up an author you know, go, hey, let's pass some stuff around. Let's bat around some ideas and get a book together, because many of like my top 50 favorite speculative fiction reads, and take a shot every time I say that word, are author collaborations, which are pretty rare to occur. Putting the romance lens back on though, this is the first time I found myself really emotionally invested in the relationship between two non-humanoids, even in like the slightest regard, two entities beyond our understanding, yet their bond, what happens between them, becomes so nail-biting because there's also this edge of distrust that I found to wonderfully season what was already just like a phenomenal story. It's a perfect book, and I'm so happy to say has firmly laid itself in at my number 2 spot, which leads me to my number 1. I had to pick my favorite Wheel of Time book, and this is something I have changed my mind on many times, but I wanted here and now to be my definitive statement of this is the one that I enjoy the most, I think is also the most impressive, and for many reasons is truly something that cannot be replicated. That would be the final book in the Wheel of Time series, A Memory of Light. I remember the day I started reading it. I remember the day I reached the last battle chapter, and I remember the moment I finished it, and it hit me like a car crash. It still also might be the book I consumed the fastest comparatively to its size. And I'm fully willing to admit, the circumstances around Memory of Light absolutely helped bump it up higher on my list here. Maybe I like Knife of Dreams, Robert Jordan's final book in the Wheel of Time series, a bit more. Robert Jordan is responsible for America's greatest fantasy epic, hands down, and tragically he was unable to finish it. The final books were finished by Brandon Sanderson, who since then has become America's biggest non-live action adapted yet fantasy author. Someone who was a diehard fan of the Wheel of Time growing up, and in some ways it is a passing of the baton. And in hindsight, it's becoming more clear that that's what this send-off for Memory of Light transition was. But beyond that, even in the context of the Wheel of Time, A Memory of Light is something that there are problems. I mean, sure, Matt feels a little different for a while. Padan Fain, a little disappointing with the end there. But within A Memory of Light's pages are still many of the most incredible scenes fantasy has ever had to offer. From, yes, the last battle to Rand's final conflict with the Dark One, death of many characters, and revelations about the world and world building that recontextualize the entirety of Wheel of Time in hindsight. A Memory of Light itself is one of the most impressive epic reads fantasy, science fiction, speculative fiction is going to ever have to offer. I mean, it's the payoff of 15 books. And not only did it overcome a worst case scenario for an epic fantasy series, any series, and having an author pass, but it managed to do so with flying colors. Rand al'Thor, Matt Cawthon, Perrin Ibarra, Egwene Alvear, Nynaeve Almira, Moraine Sedai, and so many other characters got the ending they deserved. And fantasy fans around the world now get to look at the Wheel of Time as a finished work, something that there is never going to be another entry for, thank God. And in a time of constant expansion, shoving in additional books, Wheel of Time has been put to rest on a beautiful plot, overlooking the near unrivaled amount of influence it has had on the fantasy genre since its completion. And I got goosebumps. I got goosebumps right now thinking about A Memory of Light. But that is just my top 10 speculative fiction books, with it being me, a hard bend towards science fiction and fantasy. Let me know your top 10 in the comments down below. What ones do you think I missed that you think I actually could be like, oh yeah, I should have put that in there? And which ones are your honorable mentions as well? What are some books that you want to put in your top 10, but you can't quite justify it. I'm always interested in seeing those as well. Like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. Check out my books, Neon Ghosts, or the Lawful Time series. And most importantly of all, if you're interested, go to danielbgreene.com and pick up a wonderful piece of merchandise for Pride Month today.